Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Disney Lorcana Meta Report, a new weekly series where I bring you the very best decks in Disney Lorcana. Today is day 0, the day into the Inklands releases, but I've already got 13 of the best decks for you. If you're excited for this series, give it a like and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a video. Okay, the first deck we're going to cover is Mufasa. Why is it called Mufasa? Well, because I think this card is not very good and I'm putting it in the D tier. There's a few different ways you can go about building Mufasa. You can also combine it with Emerald, but this is my friend Moyen's deck, who I did play against him, and he absolutely wrecked me with his evasive Minnie Mouse and evasive Pongo. So you can also definitely pair Mufasa with Emerald, but my friend Moyen paired it with Ruby. You get a lot of evasive threats here with Minnie Mouse and as well with the Pongo. But I must admit, and Moyen would admit himself, that Mufasa felt like the worst card in this deck. And I just don't think Mufasa is the way to go when I'm not expecting Be Prepared to be in the meta very much. I think Mufasa is on the shelf for now and will become relevant again once Be Prepared inevitably finds its way into the meta. There's a bunch of ways you can build Mufasa. You can play it with Ruby, perhaps you can play it with Emerald. However, for me, a big part of the reason that Mufasa was considered a good card last set is because it was one of the only ways of countering Be Prepared. Ruby and Amethyst Be Prepared decks were everywhere last set. If Mufasa is removed by Be Prepared, it summons a character onto the board. So it's one of the very few tools that aggressive decks had of surviving a Be Prepared hit. However, with the introduction of Ursula and Bare Necessities, both Emerald and Amber have 2-cost cards which are able to discard Be Prepared from the hand of the opponent, and I therefore expect Be Prepared to be a lot less common in the metagame, and therefore Mufasa not to be a serious card. It just quests for 2 a turn. A lot of the time your opponent's just going to ignore it, and I do not believe in this card. I suppose then next we should talk about the classic control decks, which is the Ruby Amethyst decks. What I would recommend you doing is, if you're someone that enjoys playing Ruby Amethyst, I would pretty much just stick with the same list that you've already been using, but you definitely want to be adding in Chernobog's followers as well as Madame Medusa. These are the 2 new tools which are particularly strong for this deck. I do also want to give a mention to Queen of Hearts. She is a very powerful rush card. Considering your Be Prepared is going to be getting discarded quite frequently, Queen of Hearts can help you stay in the early game a little bit longer. I'm also playing 3 copies of Pan Shadow. This is because it's going to turn all of your other characters with Rush into evasive cards. This means, for example, Maui is going to be a great way of dealing with Jafar. It's also going to be very strong against other Minnie Mouse stylish surfers, but the Peter Pan Shadow is definitely the most cuttable card from this list. You also might want to play 4 copies of Maleficent. I also think that Queen of Hearts could be dropped for something else, but it's nice to have a card on turn 2 to give you some aggressive tempo. Again, I would pretty much just stick with the Ruby Amethyst deck of your choice from last season, but add in Chernobog's followers and add in 4 copies of Madame Medusa. I mentioned that already that there's these 2 new cards, Ursula and the Bare Necessities. So Emerald and Amber having access to discard tools to remove Be Prepared from the hand of the control player. This is a huge deal. Ruby and Amethyst often very much relied on having the Be Prepared board wipe on turn 7 to deal with a lot of decks. But if that card gets discarded, suddenly the deck has become a lot worse, in my opinion. While this deck did get some very powerful new tools, in particular Madame Medusa, I just don't think I see this deck doing that well in the metagame. I'm torn between B tier and C tier, and I'm going to be controversial. I am putting Ruby Amethyst Control in the C tier. I don't think this deck is going to be great. Is it still going to be solid? Sure. But I think there's going to be a lot better options. I think Ruby Amethyst Control has finally left the metagame because of Bare Necessities and because of Ursula. It's important to remember that this control style of deck always struggles against aggressive decks, and now that Emerald and Amber, 2 of the most aggressive ink colors, have got access to these cards, I think that Ruby Amethyst Control is really going to struggle this set. Another way of playing control then is Ruby with Sapphire. What this allows you to do is it allows you to ramp up to your other control tools a little bit quicker than you can in Ruby Amethyst. This is my early take on Popsicle control. I do think this is going to be the better way to play control, but I also think there's a lot of room for experimentation here. For example, this deck is currently playing 4 copies of Hydra Deadly Serpent, but we already have a lot of options in at 6 costs that are uninkable. Lady Tremaine and Madame Medusa do seem like better options. It's also possible this deck wants to add in some locations which are gaining a lot of lore and have big defense. Of course, you could also consider dropping the Mickey Mouse in favor of going for Grammatala, as well as the new 7-cost legendary Grammatala. So there's definitely some room for experimentation here, and this is definitely a deck which I think is going to improve once the lists are slightly more refined. This deck can ramp into Be Prepared. Playing Be Prepared on turn 5 or turn 6 allows you to have a very slow early game, and even if your Be Prepared is discarded by an Ursula or Bare Necessities, cards like Maui, Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, and Queen of Hearts can give you that aggressive start to control your opponent's questers. What this deck is currently struggling in, though, is lore. So I can definitely see this deck developing to play a few locations with big defense while you control the board and stop your opponent from being able to challenge your locations, which gain that passive lore. Of course, you can play Be Prepared and it's not going to remove your location. So there's definitely some interesting synergy there to experiment with. So even if your Be Prepared is getting discarded by an Ursula or a Bare Necessities, you still have access to your board control tools like Lady Tremaine, Madame Medusa, Hades, quite a bit sooner than you would in Ruby Amethyst. There's still definitely some refining and tweaking with this list. It's not a deck I've been able to spend as much time on, and I'm sure in the next week this list will become more refined. For now, I think I'm going to put it into the B tier. I think it's a solid deck and is going to be a better control deck than Ruby Amethyst because you can ramp more quickly into your control tools and therefore you're able to deal with these aggressive decks a little bit better, even if your Be Prepared gets discarded. Oh boy, up next we have Jafar. I have a whole deck guide on Jafar, which I posted yesterday. Okay, this is my favorite version of Allin Jafar. It's slightly different from the list that I shared yesterday in my video in the fact that I added the Jafar Wicked Sorcerer in place of the new super rare genie, and I removed And Then Along Came Zeus for Baboon. Baboon is just an inkable card which is able to remove aggressive aggro threats. So if you're playing against Lilos, for example, this Baboon is going to save you 6 or 7 lore and can be the difference between winning and losing, and it's also an inkable card. The reason I love to play so many Jafars in this deck is it allows you to be a lot more aggressive in your mulligan. You're looking for a whole new world, and Jafar Striking Illusionist in particular in your opening hands, and therefore including so many of these other Jafars allows you to mulligan aggressively and confidently to find those combo pieces, and also you're happy to put them into your Inkwell because you just have an abundance coming. This deck is so all in on the Jafar strategy, where you're just looking to exert your Jafar with a whole new world once, and then just slam a bunch of card draw as soon as possible to get to 20. You're overloading your opponent's removal tools with all of these smaller Jafars, and I think that this deck is an absolute powerhouse and very, very refined. This is the list I'm most confident with being an optimal version. I'm sure a few things will change, and you can of course play Jafar in a more mid-range deck where you have more control options, but I really do believe that this is the way to play Jafar. It's the deck I've sunk the most time into optimizing. I've gone through some different phases of Jafar. When I first saw the card, I thought, oh my god, that is so busted, what on earth? And then I went through the second phase, which was, oh, but if people can remove the smaller Jafars, then this deck is just going to fall apart. And then I got to the third stage, which is where I'm at now, which is that I've built this deck in a manner where you're so all in on this Jafar combo, and you're playing the game in a non-linear fashion. If you play a bunch of the smaller Jafars, your opponent is going to have their removal overloaded. There's only so much removal you can have in your hand in a Disney Lorcana game. And I think it's very, very difficult to completely stop this Jafar combo going through if the Jafar player plays well. And I think this all-in Jafar strategy with cards like Boss is on a roll gives you a lot of consistency. I think it's a very high skill ceiling deck. The other thing is the whole new world combo can be disrupted by the Ursula and Bare Necessities, which are very great which are super meta-relevant cards this set. However, with the bosses on a roll, if you're a very high-skilled player, you are able to put the whole new world potentially on top of your deck at the exact moment that you need it. So on turn 5, you can plan to draw a whole new world, which means that you can dodge Bare Necessities and Ursula quite consistently. I am torn between putting this deck in the A tier and the S tier. I'm gonna put it in the S tier. I think it's good. I think this deck is really good. I honestly do. I've done some testing in some scrims. It might end up moving down, but if you don't have the answers to deal with this deck, it is just going to beat you a lot of the time. It can get to 20 very, very quickly. The meta is going to absolutely form around this deck, and therefore it might slide down the rankings as the meta develops. But on day one, I am a big believer in this Allin Jafar deck, and I would really recommend playing the list, which I shared in my deck guide. Okay, up next we have Bounce. This is an Amber and Amethyst combo deck. This is my early take on the Amber and Amethyst combo. This one actually includes the 1-turn knockout Merlin Shapeshifter, because I do think that's a really fun option to have, and it is what inspired the deck. If you're not familiar with the combo, I did do a whole video on it, where the idea is you get 2 Pride lands down on the boards, you get a Prince or King in each, which is either Simba or Kuzco, and then you can, with your Merlin Shapeshifter on the board, cycle Madam Mim snakes infinitely, playing a snake as they cost 0, picking up another snake, and then rinsing, repeating, which allows your Merlin Shapeshifter to get to 20 lore. However, a more optimal version of this deck is going to simply remove the Merlin Shapeshifters for Lilo, and I also think that the Maleficent Sorceress could be replaced for the 1-cost Maleficent, essentially playing 8 Lilos and being a super aggressive deck. However, I haven't had as much time to test that version of the deck yet, so I wanted to share with you the Merlin 1-turn knockout deck, which is the one that I've played. I really do see this being a super strong deck, and one of the best ways to play Amethyst in set number 3. The Bounce package just feels fantastic with these Amber cards, and Perdita is an incredible top-end card, one of the best legendaries in Disney Lorcana. I built this deck myself after being inspired by the 1-turn knockout Merlin Shapeshifter combo, but I did end up removing the Merlin Shapeshifter from the deck. This can be an incredibly aggressive deck, playing up to 8 Lilos, because you can play Lilo, Maleficent. You've got lots of very good 1-drops. You have Simba and Pride lands and Madam Mim bouncing back your aggressive tools. I think this deck's just got it all. It's got a very aggressive early start, but then also a good top end in the form of Perdita, who is incredibly difficult to deny. I think this is going to be one of the top decks in the set, and a contender for best Amethyst deck alongside Jafar. I'm going to go ahead and put this one up into the S tier as well. Up next, we have Discard. Discard is a very interesting deck where you're playing cards like Prince John, perhaps Bucky. Discard looked pretty good during set 2 for a while, but it had one big issue, which was that it lost very hard to steal because of cards like Tinkerbell, but moreover, Grab Your Sword on turn 3 or 4. I haven't had the chance to test Discard, but I have played against it quite a bit, and I do think that it's going to be a very difficult deck for a lot to deal with. This is a lot more all in on forcing your opponent to discard their whole hand. We're playing Bucky on turn 2, followed by Prince John on turn 3 into lots of Floodborn characters to force your opponent to discard their whole hand. Ursula, Deceiver of All, has some great options by being able to sing Sudden Chill to force your opponent to discard twice. You've also, of course, got Strike a Good Match to keep drawing some cards for yourself. Hypnotize is just a very good value card. You've also got Morph into cards like Beast, Robin Hood, and Tinkerbell, and the control of Let the Storm Rage On. There's definitely some other cards you could consider adding into this one. For example, the 2-cost Ursula is a obvious inclusion. There's also Chief Bogo on turn 4, which gives you even more value for all of your Floodborns. Definitely a deck to keep an eye on, and one that I'm going to be experimenting with a little bit more as the meta develops. Discard is a pretty solid deck, but it does struggle against steal. With Ursula being able to target Grab Your Sword, it has gone a long way. However, you also don't need to go quite as all in on this discard strategy with other mid-range Emerald Steel decks. Because you have that targeted discard, you don't need to be playing these cards like Prince John and Bucky in order to remove your opponent's best cards from their hand. I've not had the opportunity to test this deck too much, and I do think that this deck is going to be very powerful into a lot of the top meta decks, but it really, discard is more of a meta call, and therefore I would imagine in the first few weeks it's not going to be the best way to go. But I'm going to put the discard deck into B tier, and I could absolutely see this deck becoming a better deck once the meta settles a little bit more. Up next we have Pirates. Pirates is a Ruby and Steel deck where you utilize cards like John Silver and lots of locations, with including the Jolly Roger. This is my take on Pirates, which I've done a full deck guide on. I think it's very powerful with this John Silver Greedy Treasure Seeker in particular. This card can often have resist 3 and quest for 4. Even with the Jolly Roger down, it's going to get rush as well, so it can be an absolute powerhouse of a card. What this deck is often looking to do is get Captain Hook or Robin Hood down on turn 3 into a very quick A Whole New World to disrupt your opponent's strategies and put more cards in your hand. This is going to allow your Jim Hawkins then to dump a bunch of stats down onto the board on turn 5, because Jim Hawkins can feel pretty awkward before A Whole New World because it's taking 2 cards out of your hand, and this deck does struggle for card draw outside of A Whole New World and the Queen of Hearts. I think the Steel John Silver card is one of the best rares in the set. You also have access to Jim Hawkins. This deck can be really good if you can sing A Whole New World on turn 3 with Robin Hood or Captain Hook, and then you're able to, on turn 5, play your Jim Hawkins into a powerful location, and you can get a lot of lore very quickly. I do think this is a pretty strong deck and is going to prove to be a powerhouse. I'm going to put it in the A tier. I don't think it's quite got as much potential as the decks in the S tier, but I still think it's a very powerful deck within its own right and could prove to be better as the meta develops. Again, it's very early days. Up next, we have an Allin Aggro deck. This is one of my favorite decks from set 2, where you're pairing Amethyst with Ruby. So this Hyper Aggro deck was one of my favorite decks in set number 2. There's a lot of synergy between the Ruby cards as well as the Amethyst cards. For example, you can quest with your Arthur, bounce this LeFou back into your hand, and then replay the LeFou to ready your Arthur again. So it's very difficult for your opponent to interact with your side of the board. One thing this deck massively struggles with, though, of course, is steal. Cards like Tinkerbell and Grab Your Sword are going to be very popular in the meta, and that's the reason that I've put this deck so low down. This deck got a couple new tools in the form of Simba, Scrappy Cub, which is the identical card to Pinocchio, and it also got the Boss is on a Roll, which is just an inkable card which can gain you 1 lore if you're desperate, kind of in a similar fashion to the GOAT. Queen of Hearts is a great option in this deck if you're going second. These aggro decks usually are so strong going first, but can struggle to go second, so having rush cards like Queen of Hearts and Madam Mim Fox are the tempo swings, can provide the tempo swings you often need in aggro mirrors. For example, if your opponent quests with a Lilo, they might not expect that Queen of Hearts to come through and removing it on the second turn, and that is allowing you to pull back ahead in terms of board development and allow you to win aggressive mirrors. Now, there's definitely different ways you could go about building aggro. I think that aggro decks in particular would like to have access to Bare Necessities or Ursula in Emerald. I think aggro decks would quite like to have access to the Amber Bare Necessities or the Emerald Ursula to deal with Grab Your Sword. So there's definitely different ways you can go about it. Currently, though, I don't think aggro is the best way to go because of the popularity of Steel and Emerald. Morph into Tinkerbell on turn 4 is going to be absolutely devastating for these decks, and therefore I think that they're going to have a real hard place finding a slot in the meta. I think there's better ways of playing aggressive decks in this set. Up next, we have Beast OTK. This is a mid-range Steel and Emerald deck. This is my take on the best deck in the game. There's a couple different ways you can play it, of course. Instead of going for the Beast combo, you can be playing cards like Chief Bongo and then go more in on the Floodborn strategy. This Beast Selfless Protector as well is very, very cuttable. It's just a cute idea I had to try and protect Beast Relentless. You have a very aggressive early curve with Robin Hood on turn number 1, or the bio on turn number 1, gaining you passive lore. Then your turn 2 is also great with either Morph or Ursula, disrupting your opponent. Of course, you'd love to get this new Ursula, Deceiver of All, down on turn 3, and then start singing songs like Let the Storm Rage On or Strength of a Raging Fire to control the board. Or if you have a bunch of uninkables in your hand, you have access to Strike a Good Match, which is going to draw you a total of 4 cards and discard 2. So you add an extra card to your hand from this combo with Ursula. Sheriff of Nottingham can be great when paired with A Whole New World, but also if you can get a card into the bio location, every time you quest with that card, you're discarding a card, again cycling the deck, discarding pesky uninkables, and then your Sheriff of Nottingham can also put down some damage. This is really nice when you have A Whole New World in hand, but you don't want to play it. You can easily discard your Whole New World in this deck, and therefore A Whole New World becomes a lot more flexible. Of course, you've then got the Beast Relentless finisher potential, where you play Beast on turn 6, and then on turn 7, Sheriff of Nottingham, as well as the bio. You move the Beast into the bio location, and then every time you quest with the Beast, you discard a card, and therefore your Sheriff of Nottingham can deal 1 damage, which then readies the Beast, and then you can quest again, getting all the way to 20. This deck has it all. It has a really good and powerful early game, as well as lots of control and a way of winning the game in a single turn. I think this is the best deck in Disney Lorcana Set 3. Pretty similar to Discard. There's a bunch of different ways you can build this. I also shared a deck on my YouTube channel, which didn't have the Beast OTK combo, but you can just slot it in. I'm covering basically all of those mid-range Emerald Steel decks because they're all very, very similar. They do different things. There's different ways you can build them. Some without Beast, but I think most people are going to be playing Beast, and I do think this is the top deck of the set. Even without the Beast combo, I think it's an absolute powerhouse of a deck. It's just got all the best stuff that you could possibly wish for. I think Emerald is the best color this set. I think the legendary Ursula with Let the Storm Rage On is an absolutely disgusting combo. You've also got the 2-cost Ursula to discard your opponent's strategies. You have cards like Morph, which you can play Robin Hood or Beast on turn 3, or Tinkerbell on turn 4. You can sing A Whole New World early to discard your opponent's hands in certain matchups. This deck just does everything really well, and it doesn't struggle in any particular area, and I do think it's going to be the deck to beat coming into set number 3. In fact, I think you could honestly make a case to be bumping Jafar and Bounce down into the A tier and having Steel Emerald as the top contender, but I think that I do like the look of these other decks quite a bit as well. But I do think that I do think Steel Emerald is the clear front runner on day 0. Up next, we have Rockstar Emerald. Rockstar Stitch is an aggressive deck and a better way of playing aggro, in my opinion. In fact, this was the first deck I built from set 3, and I think it's very good. Yeah, so this was the first deck I built from set number 3 because I really wanted to play a Rockstar Stitch deck, and a lot of people are going to be wondering why I'm not playing Perdita in this deck, and that's because in Amber and Emerald, you just don't have enough card draw, and you don't have many ways of getting cost reduction. So Perdita has a better home in the Amethyst Amber deck. What this Rockstar Stitch deck is really good at, however, is winning the game incredibly aggressively. I would say this is the best aggro deck for set number 3. You can play your Lilo on... You can play either Lilo or the new Cursed Merfolk on turn 1 and then slam that Simba down to protect them. But then you've also got the option of this Baloo on turn 4, which is also a bodyguard to protect your aggressive questers, which when removed is also gaining you lore. Joshua Sweet is another bodyguard which costs just 4 ink and can quest for 2. Kick Cloud Kicker is a very interesting card because it is bouncing some threatening cards from your opponent back to their hand. For example, it allows you to bounce Morph back into your opponent's hands, stopping them shifting into something like Robin Hood or Tinkerbell. With Morph, you're able to more consistently get your Rockstar Stitch down early and then start cycling cards. And with this deck, you never ink more than 4 cards. You stay at 4 ink maximum. There's also the new Kidder card, which is a fantastic finisher and gives you an extra turn of questing. Cards like Baloo are also great, where you're getting guaranteed lore if it's removed from the board while also being a bodyguard. I think this is a really strong deck. I'm going to put it in the A tier. Up next, we have songs. Songs did get some new tools, including bare necessities, and there's lots of different ways you can build songs. Of course, you can go down Sleepy's flute route, or you can go for a more quest-heavy build. Steel Songs definitely has a bunch of different ways you can go about building it, and I'm not 100% settled on this list, so definitely feel free to play around with this one a little bit more yourself. We've got a few new additions, in particular the Bare Necessities, a new 2-cost song, which is great at disrupting your opponent's threats, as well as And Then Along Came Zeus, which is a complete powerhouse card and should be a great fit for this list. There's also the exciting inclusion of a single Chernabog, which at some point is going to be able to play potentially for just 0 cost, which would be absolutely fantastic. I do like the option of Perdita as a top-end card, but the fact that it's uninkable does mean you could decide to remove it, because this deck already has a lot of uninkable cards. Of course, you could also go a completely different route with this deck and play Sleepy's Flute. Again, feel free to play around with this a little bit more. It's not a deck I've had that much time to play with, so I'm not super settled on this list by any stretch, but I still wanted to share with you what I threw together. I still spent quite a long time on this list though, and I think that it's going to do you a solid job, but don't be afraid to try and improve this list in particular. Songs, I'm really not sure where it's going to sit in the meta. I'm kind of leaning towards B and A tier. I'm going to put it in the bottom of A tier because Songs I think has always been a good deck and it did get better with this release, but it's quite a difficult deck to build. So I'm going to put it in the A tier, but I'm honestly not sure with this one. I could see it being a bit better, a little bit worse. Up next, we have Steel Wheel. This is the Sapphire Steel deck, one of the top contenders from set 2. So the Steel Sapphire deck is still looking to do very similar things with Fishbone Quill on turn 3, Cogsworth or Beast on turn number 4, and then singing A Whole New World very quickly. But you can also be getting this Grammar Tala card down nice and early as well, which can give you a more aggressive approach. There's definitely a lot of considerations with this one and room for experimentation. I think, for example, locations could work very well with this deck to gain you passive lore because you don't have much aggressive lore early on. You also have the Flaversham and Popsicle synergy to be getting yourself some card draw if your Whole New World gets discarded. I also like the option of Develop Your Brain and Gaston to help you draw your combos a little bit more consistently, which are going to be particularly important if your Whole New World gets discarded from your hand. One thing I don't like about this deck, though, moving into set 3, is the fact that these Ursula and this Bare Necessities cards exist. This makes the deck a lot less consistent. What this deck was looking to do was play Fishbone Quill on turn 3, and then on turn 4, you play a 5-cost cards like Cogsworth, and then sing A Whole New World as soon as possible, recycling your hand, and then you can keep dumping cards with your Fishbone Quill, and then you win with Bell. However, this deck became a lot less consistent because of Ursula and Bare Necessities. Now, of course, a lot of you are going to say, well, I can just mulligan my Whole New World and then it can't be discarded. And while that's true, you then still need to draw your Whole New World, and that does just make the deck a lot less consistent and therefore a lot worse. Of course, the deck did get some new tools, in particular Grammar Tala looks really interesting. So I do think this deck is still going to be a solid meta deck, but controversially, I'm going to put it into the B tier because I do think it became a lot worse, and I do think the consistency of this deck is the thing that it needs most, and I just don't think it's going to be as relevant in the new metagame. Finally, we have Tiana Hand Dump. Now, of course, there's going to be other decks being discovered in the next week. So in the next meta report, I'm sure we'll cover even more lists. Tiana Hand Dump is a deck which probably wants to play the new Pride Lands location, cards like Pluto, where you can just be dumping your cards down pretty early. This is also going to be stopping combos like Jafar. Beast OTK often also wants to be singing songs and things like that. It should just be very good against a lot of decks. This is the Tiana Aggro deck, and actually a deck I've not tested myself. However, I did play against my friend Moyen using this, and I was very impressed. The ability to go Pluto on turn 1 into the Prince on turn number 2 is an incredibly deadly combo, particularly when the Prince is, of course, a Prince, which synergizes very well with the Pride Lands location. Simba also being a Prince means that if you can get one of these bodyguards into Pride Lands, you have a 5 defense bodyguard, which also is reducing the cost of every card in your hand by 1. I think this deck could prove to be a complete powerhouse, and I'm really excited to test it a little bit myself. Also, the ability to get the Prince down very early is really scary. Pluto into Prince on turn 2 is a devastating combo, and of course the Prince also gives you cost reduction in your Pride Lands location. I think this could prove to be a really powerful deck, and it needs some more testing, but the list I'm sharing with you is the one that my friend Moyen built, and I am going to be sharing a video where I played against him using this deck in a few days' time. I'm going to put Tiana hand dump into the A tier, but I could see it being better or worse. Again, it's very early days. So this is my take on the Disney Lorcana meta on day 1. I don't think you want to be playing Mufasa or classic aggro. I would avoid Ruby Amethyst control, but it could prove to be better than I'm giving it credit for. And if you want to play control, I would probably be looking at playing Ruby Sapphire. And again, a lot of these decks are going to be shifting up and down. This is just my early hot takes, having tested a lot of stuff. But of course, I'm excited to see where everything settles. I would love for you to share your opinions on my meta report. What deck do you think is the top deck to beat? Do you think I've massively overrated or underestimated any deck? And do you think there's any deck which I haven't even mentioned, which you think I should be looking at for the next meta report?